Testing, testing. All but Vivian and Janet. So
So we're right at the line.
5. Yeah, Melissa should be here. So, yeah, so we should have 6. Otherwise, if she doesn't show, then we're right at the line.
Go right here.
Melissa Antle,
Present.
Will Kearns,
Here.
Daniel Larson,
Here.
Scott Ohm,
Here.
Richard Peterson,
Here.
Jahi Simbai,
Here.
Janet Leo, and Vivian Voss are absent tonight.
The next order on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Is there a motion to approve the order of the agenda?
So moved?
Can I get a second?
Second.
Are there any additions or corrections to the agenda? Seeing none, please vote.
Motion passed 6-0.
Is there a motion to approve the order of the minutes for July 18, 2019 to order?
July. Sorry, I got the wrong page. Sorry about that.
So moved.
We need a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Any additions or corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, call for a vote.
Motion passed 5-0 with one abstaining.
I will now open up the public forum. This is the time for any person to speak on any subject not appearing on tonight's agenda. We have 4 cases. Is there anybody signed up?
No one
What?
has signed up.
Okay, thank you. That would conclude the public forum. I'd like to welcome the members of the public and ask that you respect the statements made by city staff, the applicant, and my fellow planning commissioners during the proceedings. Please do not clap, yell, boo, make commentary from the audience, or otherwise disrupt the proceedings. I would now like to open the public hearing for case number WSP-19-02, an application filed by Tyler Downs for approval of a master sign plan for a property zone mixed-use commercial located at 7333 and 7391 West 38th Avenue, and would ask the applicant, staff, and anyone from the public who plans to testify or comment, please stand, raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth in the matter as you know it? Thank you, and ask for the staff report.
Can we get that front light to dim? Hi everyone, I'm Scott Cutler. I'm a planner with the City of Wheat Ridge Community Development Department. We're here to hear case number WSP-1902, which is a request for approval of a master sign plan at 7333 and 7391 West 38th Avenue. I'd like to enter into the public record the contents of the case file, the zoning ordinance, and this digital presentation. The properties within the City of Wheat Ridge, all appropriate notification and posting requirements have been met, and therefore Planning Commission has jurisdiction to hear the case.
So noted.
Could we dim the front lights, please? Thank you.
Thanks. So the property we're looking at tonight is at the corner of 38th and Upham Street. It's about 3.9 acres, and it's actually across 2 lots which are in the same subdivision, and they're also under the same concept plan and site plan called West Inn 38. There's a shared access point between the 2 properties on 38th Avenue. Zoning of the property is zoned MUC, mixed-use commercial, and it's also surrounded by mixed-use commercially zoned properties as well as mixed-use neighborhood along 30th Avenue. So the property is currently under construction, or at least Lot 1 is the West Inn 38 mixed-use development. Vectra Bank, which is on Lot 2, was constructed last year and has been occupied there about a year or so. This is the primary corner of the building at the intersection of 38th and Upham Street, and Vectra Bank is on the left, far left of this image. This is the most visible corner and the location of the proposed blade sign, which I'll describe later. This is a view of the property looking north across 38th Avenue with the retail spaces on the first floor. You can see that glass was recently installed on the first floor, and then you've got the apartment units above. Tenant awning and wall signs are proposed along this frontage. It's another view looking north across 38th Avenue. You can see the existing Vectra Bank signage, which wouldn't be changing as part of this plan. There is a proposed property awning sign that could be seen in the distance from this location where the 2 wings of the main building intersect. So where that white portion is right here would be where that tenant awning sign would be, or sorry, the property awning sign. And then lastly, this is a view of the western facade of Vectra Bank. It's currently without signage, but is actually the most visible facade from people traveling east on 38th Avenue. And as part of the sign package, they've requested allowances for wall signs on this frontage. Quickly, I'll go over what a master sign plan is. I have presented one to you before, but as a refresher, purpose of the master sign plan is to encourage well-planned, well-designed, and unified signage for a large property while still allowing for identification of individual businesses and buildings. It can vary from the sign code, which is Article 7 of Chapter 26, and it's essentially like a planned development for signage. It's approved by Planning Commission and recorded at Jefferson County. Does not change the zoning, it doesn't change the permitted uses, and the building site plan has already been approved, so it's simply approval of a signage plan for this property. Not all properties are eligible for a master sign plan. They must be at least 2 acres in size, under unified control, and be comprised of commercial, mixed use, or industrial development. In this case, the property is larger than 2 acres, and while the 2 lots are under separate ownership, the site is subject to the same concept plan, site plan, and subdivision plat regulations. Further, the development functions as a single development by nature of the shared access drive and emergency and public access easements throughout the site. So these are the locations of the proposed signs. As with all master sign plans, the plan allows some flexibility on final locations, which we will ask to clarify on sheet 3 of this plan. Wayfinding sign general locations are shown with the red stars. Then you've got more in the western parking lot that are actually grouped along the parking lot. Rendering of the general locations on the building elevations are found on page 2 of the sign plan, and then sign locations in isolation are on page 4. So the request tonight, full analysis is provided in the staff report, and signage is expected to comply with the standards of the city's sign code, except as modified by this plan. So I'll go through the applicant's requests. And this project is different from other master sign plans that you may have seen because buildings take up the vast majority of this site. So there isn't space for traditional freestanding signs that are commonly found in more like strip malls or office campuses. The applicant has proposed one property identifying blade sign, which would be on the front of the building at the corner of 38th and Upham. It's 50 square feet would be the maximum size with a projection of 52 inches, and this is a rendering of that sign. Staff finds that this is an appropriate request given the sign will be proportional to the large building and because the sign will act as the primary identifying signage for this development. There were originally freestanding signs that were proposed for the development, but there really isn't space and it would actually interfere with site triangles for the development. This is the view of the proposed property awning sign on the internal access drive. So the city can't actually dictate content of signage under our sign code, but an applicant can self-impose restrictions such as intending signage to identify the development. And in this case, they have. Its maximum size of 10 square feet is also a self-imposed limitation, but it still allows for front entry identification of the building. And it separately defining this sign allows some differentiation between this sign and tenant signage, and I'll go into that in just a minute. The applicant has also proposed some internal wayfinding signs with a maximum height of 5 feet and a maximum area of 6 square feet. This is larger than the city code allowance, which is 4 feet tall and 4 square feet. But we do believe this is an appropriate request given the large scale of the development and the multiple access points and tenants that are proposed on this property. It will definitely be useful for identifying multiple tenants and multiple entrances of the building. There are 2 proposed in the right-of-way, 2 proposed wayfinding signs, and detailed locations are provided at time of building permit. This master sign plan shows general locations of the signs, not specific locations. So at time of building permit, we'll get information on detailed heights and setbacks, and will be reviewed by Planning and Public Works for compliance with the master sign plan, as well as site distance. The Public Works Director must approve the permit and execute a license agreement with the applicant to locate any signs in the right-of-way, which will be done at time of building permit. We do actually allow signs in the right-of-way not part of a master sign plan, and this sign would have met 10 of 11 of our criteria. The only exception is it being new development. So in this case, one of the reasons why wayfinding signs are included in this master sign plan is because it's considered new development. It's not complete yet. There are some sign locations on sheet 3. Those aren't to scale yet and doesn't have to be for the purposes of the master sign plan, just at building permit. We're also proposing to add a couple of additional details on sheet 9, stating that the sign height could be up to 60 inches, but if we find that there's a sight distance triangle issue as far as signs obscuring views, we could request that sign to be lowered. Getting into the tenant and wall awning signs, the plan actually creates 2 wall sign categories to distinguish between signs that advertise for the property itself and those that identify specific tenants. So wall signs are limited to 1 square foot for every linear foot of building or unit frontage, and that would not change as part of this sign plan. But the applicant is proposing some increased projection of these signs so that they'll actually function more like awning signs. It's kind of a hybrid between an awning sign and a wall sign. And that will allow the signs to be placed on metal railings that are surrounding the tenant spaces. There's also a request for additional frontage on lot 2, which is Vector Bank, and that would allow the western facade of that building to have a sign, which currently is not allowed under the sign code. And that's because it faces a parking lot, it doesn't face a public street or a major access drive. It's a private parking lot, and our code doesn't allow that. But this plan is actually requesting Vector Bank to have signs on the west side because that's the most visible frontage from 38th Avenue. Property wall sign, as you can see in the bottom right of the screen, is a self-imposed limitation as well. This frontage is actually 110 square feet, or 110 feet approximately, but the size is only 36 square feet, and on this side there are no tenant signs to compete with. We do send these applications out on referral. There were no concerns from any outside agencies or city departments. Public Works has approved the preliminary locations of the 2 signs in the right-of-way and will review the exact locations at time of building permit. We also sent a 15-day public hearing noticing for this hearing, and we were approached by one neighboring property owner. They didn't really express any concerns. They were just interested in looking at the plans. Other than that, we did not receive any letters or emails about this project. We are recommending approval of this master sign plan. It was determined that the site is eligible and the plan promotes well-planned and well-designed cohesive signage. Tammy's going to distribute some additional recommended conditions of approval. There were 2 in the staff report. We actually have 2 more that will provide for some more detail and clarification on the plans on sheet 3 and sheet 9. I'm able to answer any questions, and the applicant is here as well and can answer your questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's start with Commissioner Peterson. Do you have any questions for staff?
Yeah, I do. So, sorry to start the evening with these questions. There are 27 signs proposed. 23 of them are non-conforming. So 23 of them don't meet the conditions of a master sign plan. I think that's not exactly a good precedent to set. It sort of raises questions about what the master sign plan is worth in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. If you've got 27 signs and 23 of them are non-conforming, I think you have a little bit of a
Can you clarify
problem.
what you mean by non-conforming? Because they would be conforming with the sign plan, which is the purpose of creating a sign plan instead of doing 23 variances.
No, they're by your own language, there are 27 signs and 23 of them don't meet the conditions outlined in the sign ordinance, in the master sign ordinance. Now, I understand that if we pass this, then everything's okay. But my big question is, do you really want to have 27 signs and 23 of them not fit an ordinance of the city? If there's that much trouble with the ordinance, it seems to me that the ordinance has to be rewritten.
Can you point out where the 23 figure is coming from?
It's coming from your own text.
On what page, though? So I'd like to be able to reference it.
If you go through, if you start on case analysis and you switch to page 4, property blade sign, it's non-conforming.
So
It says right in the
let me
text
just
it's
maybe
non-conforming.
back up a little and to reiterate, the purpose of a master sign plan is to address a situation that's unique where our sign code doesn't apply well. So it's not uncommon for most of the signs, in all of the signs in the master sign plan, in fact, to not comply with our code. We're calling attention to all the signs that don't comply with the code. Anything else on the site would have to comply. So the sign code that we have works really well for one business on one lot, typically one story. It was never created for a development pattern like you see at West End 38, which frankly we have no other vertical mixed use multi-story development in the whole city. So we have not created a sign code that functions for that kind of development pattern. So I wouldn't be surprised if 100% of these signs don't comply with our sign code, because the whole purpose of this document is to say these signs don't comply, and here's the rule book for those, because our code doesn't work. For all the other categories, we defer to the sign code, which I think there's language, except as provided in this master sign plan, all signage on the property shall comply with the sign code. So we're intentionally creating signs that don't comply because there's a unique development pattern here that warrants a
So why are they
different
referred to
approach.
as non-conforming? If there is no standard for conformance inside a master sign plan, why are they referred to as non-conforming?
I wrote the staff report, so I don't believe I wrote non-conforming. I think the applicant letter states that there's non-conformities, and that was something that was provided by the applicant, not written by staff. So as far as I know, we wouldn't have referred to any signs as non-conforming, because by virtue of this plan getting approved, if you approve it this evening, all of the signs proposed would be conforming under the master sign plan.
And none of them conform with the city's code. So that's true. We in planner speak, we use non-conforming in a very narrow situation. But they don't conform with the city code, and that's why we're doing this document.
As I read through this, I couldn't really figure out what the reasons were for creating these, quote, non-conforming signs. I mean, it's not my language, it's in here. So at one point, they propose a 52-inch, I think 52 inches from the building, or 52-inch width. And in your text, you say it's only 4 inches more. Well, I could turn that around to you and say, but it's only 4 inches more. So why not go with the code?
Yeah, I mean, so a master sign plan, like a plan development, is essentially a negotiated document to address only the signage component of a property. I think in this case, there's a couple reasons why we had to do a master sign plan. Only 4 inches, but we often negotiate with applicants to get it tighter, where we say like, well, why would it be 12? Can it be less? This feels out of scale. Usually we're negotiating, why is it only 10 feet closer to the setback, for a freestanding sign? In this case, the master sign plan's warranted, one, primarily because there was a desire to have signs in the right-of-way. We allow signs in the right-of-way. Scott mentioned this in his presentation. We have 11 criteria. It was created for one very specific instance, and we've applied it in a couple cases. Because this is new development, we couldn't allow signs in the right-of-way because that's one of the 11 criteria. The site is unique. Our code does not address how do you get signage, appropriate signage for businesses we want to support when you have a 0-foot setback, essentially. So part of it is the signs in the right-of-way. Part of it is sort of a sign that's scaled appropriately for a 4-story building. I think at one point we were like, is there anything else? Are we doing the sign plan for only maybe 1 or 2 categories? But the more we sort of sussed it out, we realized there really is sort of the property versus the tenant signs and the need to define things a little bit more uniquely. So it's not as robust of a sign plan as we often see, because they don't need it for as many different categories of signs as you sometimes see on other properties. But for those that they do need it, like the signs in the right-of-way and a blade sign that they've designed to be scaled appropriately to their building, it resulted in this document. So it's not a huge request, but there were enough variances from our sign code that we steered them towards the master sign plan, and perhaps not so many that it feels like it warranted this.
So I go back to my comment, though, about that so many of these, they're not, the variance from the sign code is not justified. Like, usually there are 3 development identification signs in their sign code, in their sign plan. Is it really necessary to have 3 development signs? One of them posted high on the residential section of this development, and it's a rather large sign. So, I mean, how many signs do you need to develop, to identify an apartment building with some retail at the bottom? I mean, it seems excessive.
I would actually argue the opposite. It's a very large building with multiple street frontages, so by virtue of the code, kind of ignoring what they proposed here, they would already be allowed 3+ larger, much larger wall signs. So they're actually, by virtue of the sign plan, negotiating their allowance down to allow for more cohesively thought out and I guess good locations of signage. By virtue of our code, the building, if it's 200 feet wide, they could have a 200 square foot wall sign, and they're proposing a 36 square foot wall sign. So from our perspective, and from, if we were just looking at it from the code's perspective, it's actually significantly less than they could be allowed. But again, master sign plans there's trade-offs made, so they're requesting a slightly larger blade sign than they would be allowed, but they're also requesting smaller wall and awning signs than they would be allowed. So there's a trade-off.
But should there be a trade-off? I mean, over and over again, it was in the write-up, it says, well, there's no one of those standalone signs. There isn't one of those, and therefore we're going to allow all these other things to happen. Is that a good trade-off?
That is, that's the purpose of this document. It's a purpose of a plan development or a master sign plan, is to negotiate a more cohesive sign package for a unique development pattern on a large property where they're willing to give some things up. The alternative is Upham would have a 300 square foot wall sign, 38th would have a 150, 180 square foot wall sign. They could squeeze the freestanding signs in. So we concede, we can let the applicant maybe speak to some of their design choices, but the purpose, the philosophical difference, I think, probably is that that's the purpose of this document, is to allow those trade-offs to happen.
Any more questions, Commissioner Peterson? Commissioner Simbai?
I guess for Scott. So the Exhibit 4 on page 11 in our packet is the applicant letter. And under the commercial retail signs paragraph, sort of in the middle, it says there will be 10 non-conforming blade signs. And I don't, in your report, it seemed like there was only 1 blade sign. So I got a little confused. How many signs are we dealing with? Blade signs, just that one.
Right, so that reference, they're actually proposing some very minor kind of wayfinding signs, address signs, for example, that are attached directly to the building next to doorways that would meet our sign code. And so as part of this plan, they've requested that in their letter, but we actually found that those signs meet our sign code and didn't need to be included. And they're also half a square foot of sign and changeable copy, which means they may be a greeting sign, they might be an address sign. And the applicant can probably explain this better than I can, but they're fairly small signs that are meant to be located kind of under lights on the development, adjacent to doorways or, greetings, things like that. But because they meet our sign code, they didn't need to be included in this plan.
Okay, so the letter is stating something that is not necessary in the staff report. Is that what you?
Right, so there are a few things in the letter and some details that we don't really focus on in a master sign plan, but also there are some signs, especially that you pointed out, that didn't need to be included by virtue of them meeting our sign code. So the only thing in the master sign plan is anything that wouldn't comply with our current code.
That's enough for now.
Same with the parking blade sign under directional signs. We allow parking identification signs under our code. It meets the code requirements. It's the right size, so that wasn't included in the plan.
Commissioner Antle?
No questions at this time.
Commissioner Lars?
No questions.
Commissioner Kearns?
Yeah, I want to give kudos to Mr. Downs. The building you've built on this property is an example of what I call high-quality development. I can tell that you've spent the extra money to get high-quality materials and really make this building a showpiece and an anchor for our 38th Ave sort of Main Street. And the signs, these signs are beautiful.
Commissioner Kearns, do you have questions for the staff?
I just want to say that I really like these signs. I'm happy with the sign plan. The sign is going to help make 38th Ave a more vibrant place. I'm excited for the retail that you've included in your building on the ground floor. And these signs are an excellent example of what we're trying to do on 38th Ave. And I mean, this is hand-welded by hand.
Commissioner Kearns, can you please save your comments for the discussion part after the motion?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Do you have any questions
Anyway.
for staff?
No, great job, and I'm excited to see this happen.
I have a couple questions. So just, I don't know if staff announced it, but the dimensions that are shown on page 3 are grossly in error, and that we should, as planning commissioners, ignore those dimensions. Correct?
That is correct. So as one of the additional conditions that we provided to you, condition 3, is property and building dimensions shall be updated on page 3, and also adding a disclaimer that sign locations are illustrative and not exact locations, and also not to scale. So yeah, well, that can be an added condition that we'll get prior to recordation, that those dimensions are corrected.
Yeah, that was one of the conditions. I just wanted the other commissioners to understand that. And then it looks like you've already covered I know that it appears that there's definitely 2 signs that are in the site triangles, and that those will be vetted through staff and Public Works, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Another question I have is, as I'm looking through the staff report, I'm just trying to make this, I guess, digestible, apples to apples. It talks about, let's start with the property blade sign. It talks about allowed per code, and I'm just, nowhere in there does it state, it just says 1 square foot of area allowed for each 1 foot of height of the building wall. And then it says proposed, they propose a maximum of 50 feet. But there's I can't compare apples to apples. I don't know what the building height is. I don't know how they arrived at that number, and I don't know, I guess my question is what is the allowed square feet for property blade signs?
We can actually look up that exact figure. I know that the building height does vary. It's about 50 feet in this location, so they would be allowed, if it's a 1-to-1, 50 feet. On the backside, it's about 60 feet tall, so the building actually does get taller when you wrap around it.
So it would be, so the allowed square feet, do you think, I just want to know what that allowed square footage would be for the sign. They're proposing 50, and so I can compare apples to apples. What is the allowed per city?
Yeah, so, I mean, in the case where the building height would vary, what we typically do for building height dimensions is take average grade. We'd probably take an average building height in that
Okay.
situation.
So it'd be 55,
Yeah, if the,
roughly?
roughly.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an L-shaped building, so it gets tricky. We'd look at the frontage it was on, that kind of a thing.
Okay. And then the same question for canopy awning sign, what is the allowed square foot? It looks like they're proposing 10. Property awning signs. It's also referred to as.
Oh yeah, I'm just trying to find, sorry. Yeah, so in that case, that frontage is actually much longer, and once we get the exact dimensions on that site plan, I'd be able to answer that question better. But as you can see, that frontage is really long. It's not 108 feet, it's probably significantly larger than that. So that would be their allowed square footage. It's a 1-to-1 ratio.
So we don't really know what it is, but we're sure that it's larger than 10.
Significantly larger than 10.
Okay. And then I think that probably covers, let's see, most of my questions. I think that covers the majority of my questions. Are there any other questions for staff? Yes, go ahead.
What, the master sign plan, if it's approved, does it have a expiration date? Or if somebody were to come in and purchase the property, a different developer, and want to change things, what would be involved?
If someone wanted to change it, they would have to amend the site plan, which would require another hearing in front of Planning Commission. I think, given that there's a lot of thought put into this document, it's probably would be mindful of them to at least see if they can make this work within these regulations. But yeah, that would be, they would have to come back to Planning Commission for a revision.
These are recorded at the county clerk and recorder, so they are effective in perpetuity until revised. And that's part of the reason we try to have some foresight, not just to say, okay, what does your tenant want today, but what does your owner want in 20 years, and what is our planner going to understand in 20 years from the document?
Any other questions for staff? Okay, thank you. Are there any, can we now hear from the applicant? Does the applicant wish to make a presentation? Otherwise, we'll see if there's any questions. If you could state your name and address for the record, please.
Yes, Tyler Downs, 1801 Broadway, Denver. I don't have any prepared remarks.
Okay.
I am here and available to answer questions or respond to comments at the request of commission.
Thank you. Commissioner Peterson?
No questions.
Commissioner Simbayan?
Just a question about your choices of the illumination. There's some other sort of new developments as you travel further east on 38th. They don't seem to have illuminated signs, so just wanted to get your comments on that.
Our intention here broadly is to sort of attempt to activate the retail space along 38th Avenue. And at nighttime, our goal is to have 3 restaurant and food and beverage oriented uses here. If I tell everybody if I was a kid in the candy store, I'd love to have a good mid-priced chef-driven restaurant, a nice coffee shop, and a nice ice cream shop. That's my dream. That's my vision. And if those are open past 5 o'clock in the wintertime or past 8 o'clock in the summertime, the illumination serves to give people orientation, wayfinding, attract customers, et cetera. So that was the vision behind sign illumination specifically.
Commissioner Antle?
No questions.
Commissioner Larson?
Yeah, just one question, and I just need you to hear it from you. The signs that are planned are all static. There's, do you have plans to turn any of the signs into like a moving LED TV screen?
No, I would never want that on this property or any property that I own.
Thank you.
Commissioner Kearns, any questions? Okay.
Nothing, thanks.
Okay, at this point, thank you. I have no questions. At this point, I will open up the citizens forum. There will be a 3-minute time limit, and the time may not be yielded to another person. Are there any citizens that have signed up to speak?
No one has signed up.
Is there anybody in the audience that wishes to speak for this particular case? Okay, seeing none, I will close the citizens forum. At this point, I would entertain a motion.
I move to approve case number WSP 19-02, a request for approval of a master sign plan on property zoned mixed-use commercial, MUC, located at 7333 and 7391 West 38th Avenue. For the following reasons: the site is eligible for a master sign plan. The master sign plan promotes well-planned and well-designed signage. The master sign plan is consistent with the intent of the sign code and is appropriate for the context of the development. With the following conditions: 1, the applicant will obtain building permits prior to the installation of the approved signs. 2, the applicant will execute a license agreement with the Department of Public Works for the wayfinding signs to be installed in the public right-of-way. 3, property and building dimensions shall be updated on page 3 of the master sign plan with a disclaimer that sign locations are illustrative, not exact locations, and not to scale. And 4, text on page 9 of the master sign plan shall be added stating signs located in the site triangle shall be approved by Public Works, and the sign height will be revised to state up to 60 inches.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, any discussion? Seeing none, I will call for a vote.
Oops.
Motion passed 5-1.
Okay. I will now move on to the next case. I open the public hearing for case number WS-19-05, an application filed by Terrence Horton for approval of a 2-lot subdivision with variances for lot width and lot size on property zone residential R3. And would like to ask the applicant, staff, and anyone from the public who plans to testify or comment, please stand, raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth in this matter as you know it? And ask for the staff report.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. I'm Stephanie Stevens, planner in the City of Wheat Ridge Community Development Department. Tonight we are presenting to you case WS-1905 for the Horton subdivision located at 2810 and 2816 Benton Street. And it is requesting a request for approval of a 2-lot subdivision with variances for lot width and lot size for property that's zoned R3. And with this, I'd like to enter into the public record the contents of the case file, the subdivision regulations, as well as the digital presentation. The properties within the City of Wheat Ridge, all appropriate notification and posting requirements have been met, and the Planning Commission has jurisdiction to hear this case.
So noted.
So with this, we'll take a look at the 2018 aerial that's on the screen. The property is located just west of Sheridan Boulevard and just north of 28th Avenue on Benton Street, on the east side of Benton Street. The property itself is 13,300 square feet approximately and 0.30 acres. It was originally subdivided in 1890 and currently consists of 4 lots that are 25 feet in width, which is the same situation as the surrounding properties all the way from Benton to Sheridan and between 29th and 28th Avenue. The site itself contains 2 primary single-family homes that are oriented along Benton Street, as well as a carriage unit, so a 3rd dwelling unit does exist in the rear of the property along the alley on the east side. It's important to note that in this aerial map, it does show a 4th dwelling unit, which was a previous chicken coop converted to a 4th dwelling unit that was deemed to be an illegal dwelling, so it was recently demolished. So it is no longer there if we go out to the site today. The carriage unit itself is something also important to note, is that it was developed prior to our zoning regulations in place, so prior to 1969. Therefore, it's considered legal non-conforming as it was permitted at the time of development. The zoning itself is R3, as you can see on the screen, is your zoning map. So it's in our medium to high density residential district, which is shown in the orange there. To the north is R1C, and it contains single-family homes. And then to the west, south, and east, it's R3, the same zoning as the site itself. Mostly single-family homes, a couple of duplexes, and then on the east side is a small multifamily residential development. just a reminder on our subdivision regulations, the plat's a technical document. We're really looking at what a plat does do is establishing those property lines, evaluating right-of-way, evaluating our civil construction technicalities such as traffic and drainage. It does not change the zoning on the property, the permitted uses, and it does not look at site design or building placement. As a reminder too, that 2-lot subdivisions are typically eligible for administrative approval. However, in this case, there are variances associated with the request, and that automatically requires the plat to be reviewed by both the Planning Commission and the City Council under our major subdivision review process. So with that, we'll take a look at the purpose and request of the proposal. So again, they're proposing to re-subdivide the properties from 4 lots that are currently 25 feet in width each to 2. And the proposed layout, the real purpose of it is to allow each of the primary single-family homes, one of them which would contain the carriage unit, but to be included on their own separate lots. Eventually, one of the lots could be sold if they desire to do so. At its current configuration, the homes cross lot lines. It's very difficult to establish the actual legal boundaries of those lots. The central lot line is configured in a place where the existing fencing aligns, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. And then, once again, the variances trigger major subdivision review. So this slide is really showing existing and proposed conditions as well as what those variances are requested for. The existing conditions are shown in teal, so the central lot lines that cross the property in teal, that's where the 4 lots currently lie. The proposal before you is shown in red, which delineates the 2 lots. So northern lot 1 is proposed to be larger. It meets the minimum size requirements of the zone district at 7,829 square feet proposed. And the second lot would be substandard, so that's why a variance is being requested for that, proposed at 5,471 square feet. The reason that the lot on the north side is proposed to be larger is because we kind of wanted that minimum area size requirements to be met for the lot that contained the carriage house. It also meets the minimum setback requirements for the carriage house, so there's 5 feet on the south side and follows that fence line, and just due to placement itself. Also note that the chicken coop is shown on here on this existing conditions plan, but that has recently been demolished. And the lot width variances that you're seeing here, typically 60 feet is required in R3, and the request is for 53.36 on lot 1 and 46.64 on the southern lot 2. The subdivision plat itself is 2 sheets long. Your first sheet is your typical legal description, signature blocks, data, and standard notes. One thing that is to note is that we did have them add a formal distinguishing of the alley to be reserved for public access, maintenance, and utilities. Other than that, there's been no change to the existing easements on the site. The second sheet is the proposed conditions of the plat. It does shows where those existing lot lines are, as well as the proposed lot line configuration. And something to note, I guess, as well, is that just by assessing each lot against single-family home standards versus, say, looking at lot 1 and saying, oh, there's 2 homes, let's look at it like a 2-family home and let's compare it to those standards, is because this is, the way of doing this is incrementally decreasing kind of the nonconformities over time. So if they ever did desire to demolish that carriage unit in the back, it would never be able to be allowed to be rebuilt. So you're decreasing kind of the intensity along with kind of regulating those uses that can be allowed just based on the lot size itself. So just to give you some context, looking at what the site looks like today, this is the proposed lot 1, so on the north side, 2816 Benton Street. Looking southeast from Benton, you can see kind of 2810 in the distance there, looking south. This one is looking northeast from Benton Street at 2810. This one is the smaller of the 2 homes located on the smaller lot that's requesting both variances. And then this picture is just looking in between the 2 lots so that you can see where the existing fence line lies. You can sort of see the carriage unit in the background there, but where that fence lies is where they're proposing the new lot line down the middle. This is a view from the rear alley, so on the east side of the property, the carriage house and recently demolished chicken coop. And lastly, another view from, this one's from 28th Avenue, so you're actually looking at another lot that kind of comes across, but it doesn't have anything developed on the back end. Looking through to where would be lot 1 is where the carriage unit is proposed on the north lot. I think he's proposing he would change the fence line so that it would be more delineated in terms of what lot 1 and lot 2 are all the way through to the full length of those 2 lots. So process-wise, we're not a full-service city, so we sent it out on referral to our water, sanitation, fire, etc. We did not receive any concerns from outside agencies. There was a note from the sanitation district that they wanted sewer to be on separate lines, which is it's already existing that way today, so they had no concerns further. Public Works and Planning have found the plat to be approvable, and also before the hearing, the property was posted 15 days in advance of the hearing, and letters were sent to adjacent property owners within 300 feet. We received 2 phone calls simply inquiring, hey, I saw the sign, asking what the hearing was about. Told them it was to establish lot lines. They didn't have any concerns. So we didn't receive any calls or letters of actual opposition for this case. So with this, we have 2 motions before us tonight. We have to make a motion for both the variance and the subdivision. The variance must be voted on first, and it has to receive a supermajority vote to end up being approved. So in this case tonight, we would need 5 votes to get that supermajority. This would then go to the recommendation before the city. It's a recommendation before the city council, who's the final approval authority. Just walking through a little bit briefly of the variance review criteria and staff's findings. So staff does find that the application is in compliance with the variance review criteria for some of the following reasons. It does retain the character. The proposed lot sizes are consistent with the lot sizes in the area, as well as the lot widths will be merely imperceptible from the street. It's going to look like what it does today. There's no physical changes proposed. Therefore, staff has found that it's consistent with the existing character. The configuration is also consistent with our comprehensive plan by protecting established neighborhoods and promoting those home ownership opportunities. So something unique about the property, I guess, that exists today is those non-conforming units. All of the homes on the site are considered non-conforming at the moment. And it really lends itself to being a rental property, having those non-conforming units. So the way that by replatting it, decreasing those non-conformities incrementally over time, we can then start bringing it into home ownership opportunities, and therefore we're meeting the comprehensive plan's intent. The next is that it is a unique hardship. These properties were developed and platted long ago. The plat was established in 1890. The homes themselves were built from 1917 up until 1970, and this situation was inherited by the property owner, so not created themselves. It's also substandard lots that it's actually impossible to subdivide into more than one lot, even though it contains multiple buildings, multiple homes on the property. So this way we can still try to meet our zoning regulations to the extent possible of today's time. Oops. Sorry. Go back one. Staff is also finding that the lot layout is therefore logical and preserves the historic use. There's no changes proposed, no development proposed at this time. It's simply to establish those lot lines. And because they're not increasing the intensity or changing development whatsoever, it's found to not be detrimental to the public safety or welfare. So with that, staff is recommending approval of the variance from lot width requirement of lot 1, as well as lot width and lot size of lot 2. And that would be the first motion to vote upon. The second would be for the subdivision itself, which staff is finding to comply with our subdivision regulations of the city code, as well as all agencies can serve the property. We did not recommend any conditions of approval on this, simply because there is no development proposed to occur. The subdivision itself does not result in any new dwelling units, which would typically trigger what you would see as the parkland dedication requirements. So it's keeping the same amount of homes that are there today, and then also public improvements are in place. There's curb, gutter, and a 5-foot sidewalk there now. So no streetscape, what you would normally see as like streetscape fee in lieu or dedication. There's also no development at all, so it's just proposed without civil construction drawings or building permit. So that's why you're not seeing any conditions, but staff is recommending approval of that as well. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and we do have the applicant and owner here as well tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Peterson?
No questions.
Commissioner Simon?
No questions.
Ranto?
Oh, I was voting instead of pushing my microphone.
I just have a few clarifications, maybe just to make sure I'm understanding everything.
Because right now, it's 4 lots, which are non-conforming, right? But it is legally 4 lots, but it's non-conforming according to current code. And so with this action, you would have, well, if we approve this motion, you'd have 2 up-to-date, 1 real conforming lot and 1 non-conforming, correct?
That's correct. So as they exist today, they cross over the lot lines, which makes the 2 primary residences non-conforming, and then, so there's 4 lots with 25, and they're going down to 2, which would, by grant, if we were to approve the variances tonight, it actually is conforming then situation.
Okay, so that's my second question then. So the smaller lot that doesn't meet code, lot 2, would that then become conforming by way of us approving this variance?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so in the future, if they did want to sell it, it would be considered a sellable lot, basically?
Correct, yes.
Okay, and then just overall, I mean, I'm familiar with kind of the look and the character of that neighborhood. Do you find similar lot sizes or variations in lot sizes in this neighborhood now?
There are quite a few variations. The actual subdivision plat itself indicates that each lot is 25 feet in width. I don't know if you would be able to tell that by driving down the street, because there are some duplexes, a lot of similar situations where there are buildings crossing lot lines. So it's very similar, and you can barely tell where the lot lines actually exist today.
Okay, and when you're looking at the widths of the lot, is that including any side yard requirements? So these new lots would be accounting for side yard requirements?
Yes, they are
Okay.
taking into account 5-foot side setback requirements.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Commissioner Larson?
In the variance document, or in the variance recommendations for the following reasons, there are six items there, and number 4 says special conditions exist. Would you mind explaining again what the special conditions are?
So I went over that a little bit in the presentation. I think what makes it special is really this being a substandard size lot, so just the fact that it's undersized in general, and then the homes were built over lot lines. That's the way it was happened in 1890 was when the subdivision was established, and then 1917, they just built right over the lot line. 1970, I think, was the latest home, same situation. I think 1930 was the carriage house. So over time, it was just incrementally on an undersized property, and we didn't have any regulations in place. So they could maybe do that at the time. Then it was inherited by the property owner now, which created a unique kind of hardship for the applicant himself right now.
If I could just add, the Planning Commission doesn't see a lot of variance requests because we say no to 90% of people who ask for variance for whatever reason. You're obligated to review the variance when it's associated with another application. And so the question we always ask ourselves and any applicant for a variance is, number 1, is there a real physical hardship, not something that's inconvenient? And number 2, why should the rules that apply to everyone else in the city not apply to you? And in this case, the special situation is the fact pattern that Stephanie just described, which is unique to these lots versus, all the other R3 properties. They're probably not the only ones with this set of fact pattern, but it is what makes it, arguably appropriate to have a variance come through. We don't plat vacant lots with variances, maybe ever. But when there's existing development, it's sort of looking through it from a different lens, subjective.
And then just a quick follow-up, and this may be for the applicant, but the question is, why now? Why in August 2019 as opposed to last year or even next year?
I think the intent is kind of found in the variance letter of request that was attached as an exhibit. And I don't know if Terrence wants to touch on it, or if you would prefer to hear it from him.
We can hold that for the applicant.
Okay. Terrence, would you mind coming up, please?
No, we'll wait. We need to wait, sir.
Sorry.
Just a minute.
Sorry.
Any more questions?
Yeah,
Commissioner Kearns, go ahead.
sure. So can you tell me about the alley? The property line extends well into the alley. What does it mean for public access in the alley?
So the public alley, I believe it was 8 feet, yeah. So you can see it kind of extends, the public right-of-way extends to the southern property as well. But, so the property line, what happens is this has been, over time, historically used as a public alley. So now it's an easement rather than being like dedicated right-of-way. It's a formal easement, which means that they would not be able to develop on it. It's also reserved for, so in addition to public alley access, which is historically what it's been reserved for, there's also some utilities that lie under there, and then we need to be able to get in there for maintenance. This goes all the way north as well, so it establishes that circulation pattern just for the neighborhood.
So the easement, it's an access easement, basically?
Correct, access is primary.
Some of the city's alleys are dedicated, some are not, so they're prescriptive. Whenever we have a plat in an area adjacent to prescriptive, not dedicated alley, we try to get the public access easement.
Okay.
Yep. So no physical change, no functional change.
Any more questions?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I just want to clear something up, but as I understood it, if this passes, there are 2 non-conforming lots, not 1, because lot 1 is too narrow, and lot 2 is too narrow and too small, right?
That's correct. It does not comply with our current regulations, which is why we're here for variances tonight.
Neither of the lots created will comply with current zoning regulations.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, because you said 1. You said 1 was okay and 1 was not.
So 1 is okay for lot size,
But
which is the
not-
southern lot, and then both lots we're looking at variances on both lots for lot width.
Yeah, so they would be both non-conforming.
That's correct.
lots. Okay.
Any other questions? I have one question, just, this is a kind of unique situation, but when looking at creating the new lot line, is it my understanding that you couldn't just continue it where the existing fence was to the building and just have it go right next to the building? With the understanding that if the building was demolished, then they're gonna have to, if they rebuild, it's gonna have to be whatever that, I guess in this case, 6 feet offset.
Yeah, they just wouldn't be meeting the 5-foot setback requirement.
Right. But I'm just wondering, like, could you have, it just seems a little odd, I guess, the layout of the lot line, how, for plotting this, are the conditions of the city and or the county that we have to have that 6-foot offset from the building to the south? I'm just trying to see as far as like equitable for the,
Yeah, I think
for the
you're
lots.
looking at Exhibit 3, which shows the existing condition. So because of the location of the carriage house, the middle lot line couldn't go just directly to the rear lot line. So there had to be a jog somewhere. I think there was
Right.
some iterating on sort of where exactly that should be and what that jog should look like. Generally, best fire code is a 5-foot setback. That typically complies with the zoning code setback. So there was some flexibility in here. I think there was a goal of meeting a minimum lot area. We didn't dictate it has to be in this location, so there's probably a few different versions of where that line could look like, but there was going to be a jog no matter what.
But it had to be, for creating a new lot line, it needs to be a minimum of 5 feet.
Yeah, or you'd be
From the
seeing an
existing
additional
structure.
variance tonight for setbacks as well. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Are there any,
Is it true that you can't add new nonconformities? So drawing the line straight back and cutting off the 5-foot setback would be adding a new nonconformity, right?
Yeah, we could do that, but we'd have rolled in a 4th variance request for the setback.
Yeah, but basically you can't add new nonconformities.
We don't encourage that, yeah.
Right, okay.
are there any other questions for staff? Okay, I think there's some questions for the applicant. Is that true? Yes? Could we have the applicant come forward and state your name and address? Okay.
9 days ago, I had a total knee replacement.
Good job.
And you can adjust that height of the microphone as needed too, sir. If you could state your name and address for the record.
Thank you. Terry Horton. An address?
Yes.
Not the address of the property, but my address is 1295 Cody Street, Lakewood, 80215.
Thank you. Commissioner Peterson, questions for the applicant? Commissioner Simba? Commissioner Antle? Commissioner Larson?
And first, just let me thank you for coming down to see us tonight. I know folks that have gotten knee replacements, and it's not a good time. Again, thank you. But my question, and I'll repeat what I said earlier, is there any specific reason why you're applying for this now as opposed to maybe last year?
We've owned the property for 20-some years, 20 years, I think. We lived in the big house for 5 years, and now we're retired, and we want to get some income from the property ongoing. And it's been a difficult property to rent out with the fences the way they are, some confusion and some noise and some... We wanted to put up fences, and we didn't have to do this to put up fences, except straighten out the mess back there in the back where the fence ran right square into the dining room window of the little house. But we didn't have to have this to do that. We mainly want to possibly sell off 2810 and keep 2816 along with the carriage house for rental income. And it's going to benefit the neighborhood. I think whoever buys it, we can't say what they're going to do. But right now, all 3 of them are rentals, and they're going to stay that way. If it sells, possibility that all 3 of them or at least 2 of them, may become ownership with a mother-in-law house in the back, which would be better for the neighborhood. We're giving up through this process the right to build a triplex. I was told that was one of our options originally, was to scrape it and build a triplex. And I think there'd be a lot of opposition from that, but I don't think it would benefit the neighborhood that much. There is, I think, a fourplex right across the alley. So I think it's better that it stays 2 houses. It's been this way since the 1930s. 3 houses, actually. This won't allow any development in the future. It won't allow anybody to change anything. Won't allow them to build a triplex. And it deeds really the alleyway back to the city
Whereas when we did the plat, they came to me and they said, that alley is ours. And they said, you can park on it. That's what they told me to begin with. And on the legal, I guess you can, but I don't know all the legal jumbo, but this deeds it permanently to the city, so nothing can ever be done back there. I don't think it would anyway, but. And the new survey was very extensive in that it cost a lot of money. I'm not sure if we were wise in doing this, but the survey is going to benefit the neighborhood because they relocated lost lot lines out there. They went, I don't know how far out, several blocks in every direction, and they had to reestablish or relocate and dig up the pins that were there, which was a big job for them, and I guess they earned their money. But now the whole neighborhood it's all been uploaded to whatever system you guys have, so that in the future, any lot lines are going to be easier to find in that entire neighborhood. They had to go, like I said, several blocks in both directions. So, that's my comment.
Thank you, Mr. Horton, I appreciate it.
Commissioner Kearns?
Yeah, so I noticed that there's a shed that seems to be crossing the property line, and there's a fence that's across on the north side. The north property line seems like it's getting infringed upon by an existing shed and an existing fence. Is that?
On the north side, there's a shed right there, right now, and we drug it out into the center of the lot. There's supposed to be a guy picking it up tonight and tomorrow morning.
Oh, so you're going to move it.
It's going to be gone.
And what about, it looks like a fence. There's a gate into the alley, and then the fence seems to cross the north property line and then cross back. Does that stay or does that go?
Which fence are you, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
I see a line with some X's, and I'm assuming those are.
Yeah, it looks like, again, you're probably looking at Exhibit 3. So the fence on the north side of the property is north of the property line. That's not uncommon sort of throughout the city. Your northern fence line would remain in place? Is that your understanding with your neighbor to the north?
Yes. The neighbors put in, when they bought it, and that house sold, I don't know, about 5 years ago. And they put in, there was railroad ties there building up because there's a big drop in height, probably about 3 feet from their property to ours. And I didn't know that property was theirs, but 4 feet of my property belongs to them. And obviously, they didn't want to go through the hassle of moving those railroad ties 4 feet away and going and filling it in and all the concrete and all the work and everything so that they could have 4 more feet on their property.
Okay, so it's an existing retaining wall plus a fence.
Yes.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
they will always have the option to do that in the future if they want to
Sure.
reclaim their land.
Yeah, I understand that retaining walls sometimes jump property lines. So thank you. That's all I had.
Any more questions for the applicant? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. By the way, I just want to say that Stephanie and Scott were extremely helpful. Very kind, very courteous. Stephanie stayed right on top of it. I appreciate it.
That's why we like them.
Okay, I will now open up the citizens forum. There will be a 3-minute time limit, and time may not be yielded to another person. Are there any citizens that have signed up to speak?
No one else has signed up to speak.
Is there anybody in the audience that wishes to speak? Seeing none, I will close the citizens forum. At this point, I would entertain a motion.
And maybe just a reminder for the commission and the viewing audience, we'll have to do 2 independent motions. The first will be on the variance. For any variance, you vote along the same voting standards as the Board of Adjustment, which always requires a supermajority. With 6 of you present, it would require 5 affirmative votes to approve the variance. After the variance disposition, we can move to the motion for the plat.
Mental block with that today. I'll make a motion to on the variance, I move to recommend approval of a 5.4-foot variance from the lot width requirement of Lot 1 and a 13.36-foot variance from lot width and 2,029 square foot variance from the lot size requirement for Lot 2 to allow 2 single-family lot zone residential 3, R3, for the following reasons. The application is in compliance with the review criteria. The variance would not alter the essential character of the locality. The proposed configuration is consistent with the comprehensive plan and other policy documents supported by the city by protecting the positive attributes of the community's established neighborhoods and promoting home ownership opportunities. Number 4, special conditions exist which result in a particular and unique hardship. Number 5, the proposed lot layout is logical and enables the site to be retained for its historic use. And number 6, the request would not be determined or detrimental to public safety or welfare.
Is there a second? Any discussion? Call for vote.
Motion carries 6-0.
Is there a motion for the subdivision?
I move to recommend approval of case number WS 1905, a request for approval of a 2-lot subdivision plat on property zoned residential 3, R3, and located at 2810 and 2816 Benton Street for the following reasons. 1, all agencies can provide services to the property with improvements installed at the developer's expense. And 2, the requirements of Article 4 of the Zoning and Development Code have been met.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion? Call for vote.
Motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. We will now, I'd like to open up the public hearing for case number ZOA-19-02, an ordinance amending Chapter 26 of the Code of Laws to add floodplains in the Sloan's Lake watershed to the city's floodplain maps as a local flood hazard area. And would like to ask the staff and any public who plans to testify or comment, please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth in the matter as you know it? And ask for the staff report.
So out of habit, I put it in city council presentations instead of planning commission presentations, so sorry for the delay in getting this fired up.
With us tonight, while Mark's getting this loaded, is Mark Westberg, who is in our Public Works Department. You all don't often see him because he's not our development review engineers, but he is our floodplain manager for the city.
One of the many hats I wear. So just want to give you some brief history on the FAD. FAD stands, we're all about acronyms in this business, stands for Flood Hazard Area Delineation. So it's a term that Urban Drainage and Flood Control District has used since they were founded back in 1969 to describe what the local maps that they do. So the Sloan's Lake FAB was originally done back in 1977. The reason, and we did an update that started in 2016, there's been a lot happened since 1977. We've got better topography information of the area. We now use lasers instead of just aerial photography to get topography. We have updated calculations methods. I think they probably did the original maps on cards, is my guess, for those of you that are old enough to know what cards are. And there's been some redevelopment and development in the area, and then a lot of the previous master plan from 1977, those improvements have been completed. So just wanted to sort of get everything updated on what we're doing. The project sponsors are the Mile High Flood District. I called them the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District before. That's still their legal name, but they've rebranded themselves as the MHFD with this cute little squiggle between the H and the F. I'm sure they paid a lot of money for the squiggle, but they're a great organization. You guys all pay property taxes to them. If you look on your thing, it'll probably still say UDFCD on it instead of MHFD. And then the city and county of Denver, because they're basically Sloan's Lake downstream, and then all of us folks that are upstream, Edgewater, Lakewood, and Wheat Ridge. We're all sponsors on the project. So the update, as I mentioned, was started in January of 2016. We updated the hydrology, which is how much water is getting to the watershed. They've updated hydrology metro-wide for the entire district over the last few years. And we did updated hydraulics. Again, we accounted for all the pipes and things that are now in the ground that weren't in the ground before. And then we updated the mapping. That was sort of the last step. We also looked at doing additional improvements like more pipes and things. And the only thing that they really came up with is make all the pipes bigger. And that didn't seem cost effective because none of us can afford that. So there were no new improvements planned in Wheat Ridge. There are some things they're going to do in Edgewater to try to alleviate some flooding down there. And they looked at maybe doing a pond in Wheat Ridge around Teller Street, but it didn't impact enough people downstream to be cost effective. So this is the Sloan's Lake watershed. We are the purple area right here, and purple, of course, is the color of royalty. I'm sure that was an accident. Just for frame of reference, we are located right here right now where the red arrow is. That's where City Hall is. This is 32nd Avenue, which is pretty much the upper boundary of the northern boundary of the watershed. This is 26, which is our city boundary here. This is Edgewater down here. There is a little blue dot right here. That's the detention pond that was built recently at the Richard Hart Estate as a part of the 29th Avenue Storm Sewer Project, where we took over a pipe from Denver Water. That's probably why there's no new things planned here, because we sort of already did that. We had originally identified that as like a $3 million project. We did it for like $1.5 million. So why do we do floodplains? I just want to take a step back. As Lauren mentioned, I don't come see you guys very often. The last time I think was in 2014 when we adopted the new maps along Clear Creek and did some ordinance changes. So the reason we do floodplains is to protect people and property. That's our primary goal. That's the primary focus of why floodplains exist anywhere that we've got them. The other big thing we do is we try to communicate risk to people. We want to let people know if they've got a place that's at risk. If the building's in a flood hazard area, there's a 26% chance of it flooding over a 30-year mortgage, of that area getting wet over a 30-year mortgage. So it's a 1% chance every year, but if you're a statistician, and I'm not, it comes out to 26%. There's a much greater risk of that than fire. So if you're in a floodplain, you're 9 times more likely to get wet than you are to burn. And so that's the risk that we're trying to communicate by doing this. And really, everyone's at risk. I used to live up on top of a hill behind Walgreens, and the guy at the bottom, down in hill end of the street flooded in 2013 when that hailstorm and water hit. His basement got flooded. And he's 40 feet above the nearest floodplain because the nearest floodplain is Clear Creek. So we're all at risk. It's just we're all at a different level of risk. We've identified these areas that we think these are a higher risk area. The other real goal of this is not just to communicate risk, but also alert property owners to buy flood insurance. Flood losses are typically not covered by a standard homeowner's policy. So if the tree falls on your house and knocks a hole in the roof and you get wet from that, that's covered. If the water rises up around your house and comes in through your doors, your window wells, or something like that, that's not covered. So that's the real simple distinction that an insurance agent told me once. So it's to let people know that there's a risk there, and also to alert them that they ought to buy flood insurance. So that's my little flood insurance graphic I stole off the web years ago. So in the area that we're talking about, the part of Wheat Ridge that's identified as a flood hazard area, there are 62 buildings total that are in that flood hazard area. 40 of those buildings have a crawl space or a slab on grade, so the building's basically above the ground. 4 buildings are garden level, so some part of it's underground, and then 18 buildings have basements. And so they're a lot underground. And so this is just a graphic that sort of shows where all those buildings are and where those flood areas are. So again, this is 26th Avenue down here. This is Teller Street. So City Hall is just off the map to the west. So this is what is the Ashland drainage way that comes along here and basically runs along 26 before it dives into Edgewater. And then this is what's called the Gray Street tributary because it comes up Gray Street. This is the new where the new water tanks are for the Ashland Reservoir that they built, where the new well house is sitting out of the ground. That was so cool. And then this is just basically where the low area was back in the day before they built the roads. And in the 40s and 50s and 60s when these areas were all developed, people didn't sort of mass grade things. They just put the roads on grade and built the houses where they were, and they didn't really worry about drainage that much. This was all pre-Wheat Ridge stuff. Jefferson County didn't really control things very well. And so those structures with garden level, there's 4 of them over here. And then we've got some structures with basements sort of scattered around through the whole area. So what it means for folks, if this flood hazard area is adopted as a local flood hazard area, is they'd get a notification every year. Right now, they're all getting the notification already from the Mile High Flood District. Those have been going out for several years to what was identified as a flood hazard area by Mile High Flood District. It just was never adopted by the city. When I first came on board, I looked at adopting these as a local flood hazard area, but I realized the maps were really out of date and just didn't accurately represent what was out there, and so I said we're walking away from that. But now we have updated maps. We'd like to do that. The other thing they'll be added to I have an annual floodplain meeting the last Wednesday of March, typically. Used to have the third Wednesday, but I got blizzarded out one year, so I moved it a week, and so far I'm okay. And so they'd be getting an invitation to that where we talk about sort of all things floodplain related. And the state and city requirement to disclose the floodplain status of the property, so that these folks will all now know that they're in the flood, that if this is adopted, they would know they're in a local flood hazard area. And they'd be required at a real estate transaction to disclose that to the potential buyers so that they now know that there's a flood hazard associated with the property. Insurance would be voluntary, not mandatory like it is along Clear Creek and Lena Gulch. And because this is outside the mapped FEMA floodplain, it's considered a preferred risk policy, and it would probably run less than $500 a year. Insurance is always based on how much coverage you get, what your deductibles are, and all those things. Our average price for preferred risk policies right now is around $380 a year is what we get is what the average price is. And then they have some regulations in the city code. So the reason to adopt these as a local flood hazard area is our city code regulations on floodplains would now apply to these. And so if somebody does something in that flood hazard area, they'd be required to get a floodplain permit, like build a fence or put in a shed and those kind of things. And the two big things that come out of our code that would apply in this area is if they build a structure or add on to an existing structure, the finished floor, the floor of that structure would need to be 1 foot above what we've identified as that base flood elevation for those areas. We want people, if they invest in their property, to have it be safe and not have it be at risk of flooding. And then the other big thing would be flood-resistant materials. Now, most people build fences out of flood-resistant materials because it rains on them, so they get wet anyway. This really would apply mostly to things like sheds, where you might build it with just pine or something, and then you'd put maybe masonite on the outside and then paint it to protect it from the rain coming down. In this case, at least that part that would get wet in this floodplain area, we need to be built with treated timber and probably use some kind of sheathing on it, some kind of cover on it that's not going to expand like masonite does. So that's really the only two things that really are an impact to folks with this. So the adoption schedule is we would go to City Council on October 4th. We go to September 9th for the first reading, which just sets the public hearing. And that public hearing will be on October 14th. And then at that point, there will be an ordinance adopted designating the local flood hazard area, which would then be effective 15 days after that publication, which is basically the end of October. So really just wanted to kind of highlight the applicable regulations from our code. Is if they want to do a detached garage, a shed, a fence, or a fill, then it's a Class 1 permit. If they want to do a house or an addition to house, that's a Class 2 permit. And those just have different requirements as far as the level of detail needed from the applicants. And there are certain things that are prohibited. We don't want a storage of hazardous or buoyant materials in those floodplain areas because we don't want those things floating downstream, if you will, or down the old drainage way. And dumping's not allowed there. Would be the other thing that we'd have. So we'd prefer that, if someone's going to have a compost pile, that they put it not in that floodplain area, but outside of that floodplain area. And then I just have fun with graphics sometimes. So this also happens to be FEMA's, the National Flood Insurance Program's 50th year, and is also Mile High Flood District's 50th year. So a lot of stuff was happening in 1969 in this country. And that's it. So if you guys have any questions, I'm here to answer those.
Thank you. Commissioner Peterson? No questions. Commissioner Simbaum?
2 questions. So if we don't adopt this, there was 2 things that I thought were super important. We're required to disclose that you're in a floodplain to new potential buyers, and prohibited activities like oils or whatever. Is there a way to enforce that without this plan being adopted?
So no. So when we talked to council, we talked about three options, one of which was sort of no action, keep what we're doing now, is where we don't regulate this particular flood hazard area. As a floodplain administrator, I have lots of heartburn over that because I want people to know that they're at risk, and I want them to sort of, make sure that if they do something to their property, it's not done where it increases their risk or makes it worse and those kind of things. If someone's out on their house and they happen to put a basement on right where the floodplain is, these regulations would allow them to have a basement at that location because that would be a much higher risk of getting flood damage and stuff. So those kind of things would apply. The third option was to adopt them as an official FEMA floodplain, which means all of the federal regulations apply, which means you have to get mandatory flood insurance. And there was a little chart I think I put in your packets there that maybe I didn't put it in there, but the deal with that is your flood insurance is based on how high above or below the floodplain you are. So if you're a foot above, it's maybe $1,500 a year, $1,000 a year. If you're a foot below, it's maybe $3,000 a year. If you're 8 feet below, it's maybe $20,000 a year. So we didn't want to impose that burden on folks that already had basements where they had to get flood insurance and they're going to pay equal to their house payment or more for this flood insurance when they didn't know when the house was built that there was even a hazard there. So that's why council has chosen that middle ground where they will get the notification. They're still subject to our rules and regulations. They've got to do the disclosure thing, but it doesn't have that mandatory flood insurance requirement. So that was really the big change, the big difference between those two options.
One more. Maybe Lauren, you could answer this as well. Do we have any idea of the 62 homes, how many are backed by a federal mortgage?
I don't have that information, no.
The reason why I ask because
Good question.
they have to have flood insurance.
Not if it's a local flood hazard area. So that's the distinction between adopting as a FEMA floodplain and adopting as a local flood hazard area. So the option 2 is the one that's been chosen. So yes, that was the concern as a floodplain. I would love to have them all be in the regulatory floodplain because then all the rules apply, but that seemed like a very unnecessary burden for the level of risk that we've got here. Yeah, so option 2 from your packet is the one that we're moving forward with.
Got it,
Yeah.
thank you.
So it's really about informed risk in this case, and a homeowner can choose to pay for flood insurance, right? Yeah.
Commissioner Hinton?
No, you just clarified questions I had. Thank you.
Commissioner Larson?
Yeah, thank you. What the commission is being asked of tonight is to recommend that the city council approve the LFHA.
Yeah, that they adopt this ordinance.
And that then becomes part of the city's ordinance.
Yes.
If we were to deny it or not vote on it tonight, the city council would still consider it.
Absolutely. I would still go to them and say, and give the report that planning commission denied it or chose not to vote on it or whatever the situation was. Absolutely.
It's a good question that maybe we should clarify because Mark's not used to doing a code amendment, which this is technically a code amendment. So some cities have floodplain regulations as their own chapter in a city code. In Wheat Ridge, our floodplain regulations happen to be in chapter 26. Council has sort of made the policy decision of how we want to treat the Sloan's Lake FAD. Because it happens to be in chapter 26 and you have jurisdiction over 26, you're obligated to review any code amendment within that chapter. So it feels a little funky because you don't do it very often, but the way by which we'd adopt it is by doing a code amendment in 26.
And in chapter 26, we specifically adopt certain maps and things. So what's in there now is it specifically adopts the Lena Gulch floodplain as shown in the master plan, the FAD and everything else. And it specifically adopts the Clear Creek floodplain in the same way. So we can't just add this we just can't say city council votes and puts it in. We've got to actually add this language to our code as one of the adopted maps, and this is the source of the adopted map.
And by adopting the map and this plan, that triggers the notifications and it triggers the other things that happen as you've outlined here.
Yes. Okay. Except for mandatory flood insurance.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Kearns? I have one question, I guess, is Colorado has a lot of expansive soils. How does I'm just thinking about how that area would be, I guess, moist and could get really, really moist and then it becomes dry. How does that go with insurance?
So that's not affected by the flood insurance at all. If you were, for instance, your yard got wet because it hasn't been in the floodplain and your building cracks and stuff, that wouldn't be a flood insurance thing. That's going to be a regular insurance thing based on how your foundation was built, which is a building code thing. So that's sort of the distinction. This is the water's coming down and it pours in somewhere and gets things wet. That's where the flood insurance kicks in.
Okay.
And which is generally not covered by your homeowner's policy.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions for staff? Okay, thank you. I would now like to open up the citizens forum. There would be a 3-minute time limit, and time may not be yielded to another person. You have to come to the podium and state your name and address. Was there anybody signed up? Okay. And so, go ahead and adjust that microphone. State your name and address for the record, please, first.
I'm Elizabeth Grant, 3881 Estes Street.
Thank you.
Back in 2013, he mentioned we had a flood. Now, we live right off, just 4 houses down from 38th. So we're one entire city block from 32nd, which apparently is the cutoff. You know, in that diagram, we had 4 feet of water in our front yard. I don't know how we got it. And of course, it took half the furnace out because the furnace is under the house. My daughter's car was over at First Bank, and it came up to this height on her car in the parking lot. Whoever was outdoors remembers that. And I just wondered, it's $380, he said, average cost add-on for a home for flood insurance, but we wouldn't be included in that, right? I mean, once when we had a flood, once when the city pipes broke, and we got terribly flooded, but it was a city thing, and we ate it. We asked about flood insurance, and they said we're not allowed to have it because we were not designated a floodplain, so that would still apply to us, right? Because we're outside that diagram. That's my question.
Did you have any other questions?
Is there an answer?
Yeah, I just want to see if anybody else has any other questions, and then we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Just as an anecdote, I have a family member down in South Carolina, and her copay on her flood insurance was $26,000 when her home got flooded, and the insurance paid $16,000, and she had to pay a copay of $26,000. So wow, so $380 is very reasonable.
Thank you. Is there anybody else from the audience that wishes to speak? Okay, before I close the citizens forum, could you
Sure.
shed some light on that?
So this is our first local, I should have said that, our first local flood hazard area in the city of Wheat Ridge. We have other areas, and we'll probably be identifying more areas as time goes by as flood hazards as we continue to look at things in the city. But this is our first one, so that's why there's nothing mapped anywhere else in the city as a local flood hazard area. The question about the insurance, if you're outside of the floodplain, you can buy flood insurance. And if you've got a basement, I would just go get it. $380 is pretty cheap. And so if someone told you can't have it because you're not in the floodplain, they were confused or misinformed or didn't know what they were talking about. So you can get flood insurance if you're outside of a flood hazard area. And that's that preferred risk policy that you can then get.
Okay, and then would it be possible if she needed to contact you through the city's website?
Oh yeah. My contact. If you go to the city's website, up at the very top is a How Do I tab, and if you click on that, there's a tab that says floodplain information on it. And so we have to have it within one click, or we don't get credit for it with the feds. So that's how we got it in one click. So you click on that, and my contact information down at the bottom, or you can just come by and see me or something too. So.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody else from the audience that wishes to speak? Seeing none, I will close the citizens forum. At this point, are there any other questions for staff before? Okay, I would entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion. I move to recommend approval of the proposed ordinance amending Article 8 of Chapter 26 concerning floodplain control to adopt the flood hazard areas shown on the Sloan's Lake FHAD as a local flood hazard area.
Is there a second? Any discussion? Call for vote.
Motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. Okay, I will now open up the public hearing for our last case, ZOA-19-03, an ordinance amending Chapter 26 of the Code of Laws concerning the right of protest procedure for rezoning decisions, and would ask if the staff and anyone from the public who plans to testify or comment, please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth in the matter as you know it?
Yes.
Thank you, and ask for the staff report.
Thank you. So I'll give a few comments here from the table tonight. So the Planning Commission may not have known about the protest procedure because it doesn't affect the Planning Commission public hearing. It's something that's long been in the city charter and affects city council public hearings as it relates to a zone change. So whether it's a private rezoning, like to a mixed-use property, a rezoning to a planned development, or a city-initiated rezoning. So in those instances, any zone change requires that it be approved by ordinance. By charter, any ordinance has to be approved by 5 votes. It's not dependent on the number of people present, it's 5 votes. It's an ordinance that changes the code or an ordinance that changes the zoning of a property. The charter also has this protest procedure, meaning that if property owners within a certain distance of a zone change property object to the zone change and they meet the ownership and area requirements, then the hurdle is increased so that approval of a zone change ordinance requires 6 votes. Again, not dependent on the number of people present, but it's a supermajority of council, meaning 6 members. The charter describes the area requirements, and it also describes the timing of when a protest needs to be received. Over the 9 years that I've been here, we've had a handful of protests. I wouldn't say that it's been commonplace in the last decade in my experience, but when we get them, there is still some sort of room for interpretation in the charter. So the purpose of this code amendment is to provide some clarity. We can't change the city charter without a vote of the people, but there have been instances on other topics where we've needed to clarify how we implement the charter, and that's done through a code amendment. Because the zone change process is all described in Chapter 26, this clarification naturally resides in Chapter 26. So it's clarifying the area requirements by providing that graphic. It's providing the process by which we validate the protest to make sure we're not only validating, we don't get notarized protests, for example, that say I affirm I'm the owner. So it's on staff's plate to confirm both the ownership and the area requirements are met. The code amendment changes, obligates City Council to continue a public hearing, and then it also clarifies the procedure by which a protest can be rescinded, for which the charter is silent, and the city attorneys had to make interpretations in the past. So again, having this clarity really helps, I think, both staff and the public, so there's first fewer surprises and less room for subjective interpretation. My understanding, council discussed this topic on July 1st with the city attorney, and it's my understanding that it came to them sort of for the purpose of transparency, again, for the sort of no surprises. The difference between 5 and 6 votes can be significant. As you see sometimes with your public hearings, no news sometimes is good news. It's hard to tell when people aren't testifying if it's because they are feeling opposed or in support of a case. So when you raise the bar to 6 votes, I think the purpose of continuing a meeting would mean that there's fewer surprises and more opportunity for people to testify good, bad, ugly, for or against. Council discussed sort of 3 different options in their study session: do nothing, close a hearing but continue the vote, or continue the hearing and the vote. They chose that third option, meaning that if a protest were to be received, the public hearing would remain open, and at a future date, more of the public would be able to testify, again, for or against a project. As I mentioned, city attorney drafted this code amendment. It belongs appropriately in Chapter 26, and I'm presenting it to you on his behalf. That's all I have.
Thank you. Commissioner Peterson?
Yeah, I just have a question of clarification more than anything else. It's on page 3.
Sure.
Diagram E.
Yes.
If I look through B, C, D, and F, I see that there's a radius that's included in the protest area.
Yes.
Why is there no radius included in
Sure.
E?
We talked about those little wings quite a bit in terms of trying to clarify what does it mean to be within 100 feet. So the language that we relied heavily on is directly from the charter, and in the case, the language for the property across the street is different than how it's worded for the property adjacent, and because it says property directly opposite across the street, that's sort of stopping at that first clause is why we didn't put those quarter circles on the area across the street.
Yeah, that doesn't, I'm sorry, that doesn't really explain to me why they're not there. It just says they're not there. So, I mean, if I'm looking at a piece of property and people can protest the rezoning of that property, why aren't people in those little corners not allowed to protest?
Sure, I mean,
It's not just arbitrary.
So it's not arbitrary. I mean, I think this is a perfect example why we need a graphic, because in my time, we've done a graphic memo when we've received a protest to say, here's how we measured the denominator and the numerator to come up against the 20% rule. And there has not been a graphic that's guided, are we supposed to have wings or not? So we've provided this graphic as an interpretation of the charter. It's been open to interpretation, as you're suggesting. And the only, my only explanation is that we've relied heavily on that directly opposite provision to propose, as this code amendment shows, no wings across the street. But
It's kind of tautological, though. It's there
Sure.
because it's there.
Sure. I mean, again, we'd like to have clarity. I am neutral, sort of one way or the other. I think you could think about how does this play out in real life? Does having the denominator bigger help or hurt? I don't, there's sort of infinite different scenarios that you could test this against. We've tried to test it against the 5 protests that I've had in the past to see would it have changed the outcome or not. Some yes, some no. But what we need moving forward is just how are we going to measure it so that we're clear and so the public's clear so they know sort of, if they're trying to achieve a 20%, what is their denominator? So that's really the goal.
Okay. I just like closure.
Sure.
It looks, in my mind, it just looks a lot better if you lay these all on top of each other.
Yeah, I mean,
it looks nice if you have this gray area that goes all the way around the property.
And the difference for us in the code was that for the other 3 scenarios, it doesn't say directly, the word directly opposite or directly adjacent does not appear for those other B, C, D provisions. So interpreted that to mean that there was a specific, intent there. But it's open to interpretation until we adopt this code amendment.
Any other questions? Commissioner Peterson?
No.
Commissioner Savoy?
Just real quick, if there's a protest at the time of a hearing, because it says you can do it right up until, because there's no good way to verify, it seems like it's just it stops right there, right?
So it's happened more often than not recently that the protest is received like hours before or minutes before. And in some cases where it's a very rectangular property and we can check quickly against an assessor record what the ownership is, we are able to. And in cases where it's an irregular shape or multiple protests are submitted, it can be significantly more time consuming. So it has varied of whether we've needed to recess or not or been able to sort of figure that out in that moment.
Commissioner Antal?
Commissioner Larson.
In the opening summary, it states that the purpose of the amendment would be to clarify the protest procedure. I'm still having a little trouble kind of understanding why this is needed.
Sure.
Can you give me an example, without putting any names or places or dates on it, of why the ordinance needs to be amended? What sort of triggered this?
Sure. So my understanding is that there's probably a few different scenarios. One, earlier, I believe this year, or at the end of last year, there was a property owner that submitted a protest and then rescinded the protest. The charter is silent to that. The city attorney has made an interpretation in that instance and historically on sort of the purpose of the protest right is to protect the adjacent property owner, and if they then want to waive that right, that they are allowed to do that. But it's silent, so that's an interpretation, and so it'd be nice to have that clear. The discussion tonight on what is the denominator when we're measuring the area, that has always been sort of up for interpretation. Again, it's easy on a square property. It has been significantly harder to determine on an irregularly shaped property. And I think, the purpose here, the protest right is there and should be clearly understood by the people who want to use that right, and I don't get the sense that it always is, and so this allows some clarity of sort of who could be a part of that protest to affect the outcome of zone change. And then ultimately, I think when you have a protest submitted during a public hearing or minutes before a hearing starts, it can change the dynamic, for better, for worse, whatever that your opinion is on it. It can change the dynamic of the hearing, and so to increase transparency and let the public know not only is there a zone change for property, but there's a protest against the zone change, which has affected the voting outcomes and potentially people's desire to testify for or against the project. It's of council's opinion to make that known to the public in advance, and hence the desire to continue the hearing and the vote.
Okay, I'll pass right now. I'm still kind of thinking of my follow-up question here, but thank you.
Commissioner Kearns?
No question.
I have a couple questions. So the first one is, right now it reads, the written protest to such changes shall be submitted to the city council no later than the hearing on the proposed rezoning ordinances. And I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here. So let's say that somebody really doesn't want this project to go through, and so the first person, they submit their legal protest, and then city council, the way it's written, before I feel like city council had an option of whether they wanted to recess or file a continuation of the public hearing. But with the way this is written now is that automatically there's going to be a continuation. So then whatever that is, that's a week or two, okay? And meanwhile, the developer's sitting on their hands, waiting for this to resolve. The next public hearing happens. That person that filed the legal protest, person A, they decide to rescind it. Now person 2, because this is legal code, says, hey, I want to file a written protest. So now we go a couple more weeks, and we go on and on and on, and if you got an audience of 50 people, you could just keep doing that. Meanwhile, the developer is paying money on the property. I just see this, the way it's written is, this is really unfavorable for the developer, and that's just one point. The other one I really have an issue with is that typically, even in the planning commission, we typically have our citizens forum where the public is allowed to speak on the subject, and then we close that citizens forum. The way this is written, and what it said originally, it said that on page 2, it states that the right to protest only affects the voting requirements of the city council. However, under the bill, section 1(7) item D, if the community development staff determines a protest meets the owner area requirements of Charter 510, the council shall act to continue the hearing to the next regular, and additional testimony may be taken. So you're reopening that public hearing for the citizens to make further comment, which is going to even further delay, sometimes even infuriate other members of the crowd and is going to be just really going to drag that developer down and may even possibly kill the project. I'm definitely not in favor of that. I think that should be at the sole discretion of City Council. If they want to reopen the public hearing, fine, but that should not be item D. I really am not in favor of that at all. I think that really does a disservice to the developer, because the prior to this, it's been very straightforward, like the Planning Commission, where we take the public testimony and we close that public testimony, and then we make decisions. And that's not what this is doing. This is reopening on both of those. Those are my two biggest grievances. The very, very small stuff, and I can somewhat agree with Commissioner Peterson on these graphics. I guess I would have liked to have seen this simplified, where on the graphics it just said subject property, because that's really what it is. It's the subject property in that square labeled, and then you put all the areas in gray with dimensions however you need it. And then maybe the only exception might be F, because that's got that little jog on it, but you might only have 3 maybe at the most if you included E, but you can certainly have one graphic, and just to try to, I'm just trying to read through this, and it's like, how can we make this graphic stand by itself so the typical citizen can look at this and say, oh, here's my property, here's a subject property, I need to be within 100 feet, but that's a very, very small concern of mine. I think the other ones are much bigger issues.
Sure. So the planning division is a neutral party in terms of this. We're forwarding the code drafted by the city attorney at the direction of City Council, who specifically discussed, do you continue the vote, or do you continue the hearing, or do we just leave it the way that it is? It's been fine. My observation of those discussions in the last few protests have been that this would arguably work in the favor of the developer. In a perfect world, everybody comes to a public hearing, whether they support something or not. More often than not, again, people who are sort of neutral or, yeah, fine, or I don't have an issue, are not going to be the ones who spend time in an archaic system on a Monday night at 7 p.m. or midnight or whatever it is to come and testify. So I think because the stakes are raised when there's a protest filed, and it can come down to, will you be able to get a 6th vote? We all know in our current political climate it's rare to get a unanimous vote on a zone change. And I think that this, knowing when the vote would happen and that additional testimony and that the stakes have been raised, allows people for and against a project, developer and a neighbor, to sort of be more thoughtful or decide to attend the hearing that they may have otherwise sort of thought was a predetermined outcome for or against a project. That's what we're seeing. I have not gotten feedback from the development community. We didn't do specific outreach to them, but I think the purpose here is to, we'd love to think that everybody's come to the first public hearing and have their piece, but I think the purpose here is to say, hey guys, this is serious, the stakes have been raised, if you want to come, you need to come. There have been delays. We've seen that with several of our projects this year, and there's frustration, but I think everyone wants to see it sort of the best possible presence for or against, and council's direction to have that continuance would allow people to take it seriously and attend in that second opportunity. Could it potentially play out into 10 continuances? I doubt it, just because the areas are so, we'd have to have an enormous property to have a multitude of property owners. It's usually one single property owner that triggers the protest. Sometimes 2, but in the 9 years, again, that I've seen it, usually just comes down to one property owner. And that's part of the reason that we debated as well on splitting up these graphics or not, because it really will come down to sort of one side, one property owner on one side. And when we have to do an analysis of the protests that we receive, we map every single one, and we do this 5-6 square grid to say, on this side it didn't meet it, on this side it didn't meet it, on this side it didn't, but here it did. So it's as much information for the public to know sort of where they can focus, as it is for staff who has to sort of do this mapping analysis for the case file when we get those protests. So it creates delay, but it also creates potentially more engagement, again, on sort of any side of the coin.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for staff?
Just, if I could follow up on that.
Sure.
I'm not sure it's appropriate to be talking about whether there's an advantage to the developer or to the citizens. I mean, this is the city. It isn't the Organization of American Developers. And it seems like if people want to delay this thing, they ought to be able to delay it.
Sure.
Just seems right.
The way
all
that I've heard it
democracy.
described one time was that it, by taking away the element of surprise, it levels the playing field. So I think that's probably the ultimate intent, is transparency and sort of, like you say, not giving any one group a strategic advantage, because everybody knows what the voting right is before you come into this room, right?
But the developer has to have a reasonable expectation what the process is. This is,
Sure, and it can often mean the addition of 2 weeks at the end of 18 months for a zone change, so.
Just one more thing, just to make sure there isn't a contradiction built into this. If you go back to the little diagrams, on page 2E, you could start with number 3. This is just identifying the areas. Of those directly opposite across the street from the property, extending 100 feet from the street frontage of such opposite property. Then the next paragraph says, shall extend to those property owners within 100 feet of the subject property, including those located diagonally adjacent to the corners of the subject property. I don't think the diagrams meet that. So somebody should sort of study that language, because I think the language is contrary to the diagrams.
Yeah, I think the intent was to say, the italicized text is verbatim from the charter. And I think the intent was to say, so it's the charter, and we're also going to add the wings as they're shown in the figure, versus saying, and we're going to add the wings to 1, 2, and 3. But I hear what you're saying. That's why we did the graphic.
It doesn't say that.
Yeah.
Before an item comes up in front of the city council for a zoning change, would the staff have already determined what the denominator is for the property?
No, we don't. We don't typically do that in advance. We could if somebody came and asked us to do that, but I've never had that request.
Well, you would be asked if somebody filed a last-minute protest to determine that.
Correct. Yep. So we do that exercise when we receive it, but we don't do that exercise in case we receive it. And the time-consuming part is both sort of what is the area of the specific property that came in, not so much the denominator, but the numerator, and is the ownership validated. So that's more of the time-consuming part of it.
Right.
The denominator we can usually figure out, because we'll just take that size perimeter times 100 plus the our geometry on circles, and but the time-consuming part is the numerator, which we don't often have in advance.
And you could, under section 1, item 7B, if necessary, the mayor shall declare a recess and ask that the staff continue to enable the community development to perform the review. So you would be asked to go back to your office and pull the maps and,
Yes.
put a ruler on it and figure out if that protest is valid.
Yes, yeah, before I had this surface, our zone changes are not usually the first thing on the agenda, so if we got it before the hearing started, I've gone upstairs before to do that. I've gone in the hallway, during the pledge and citizens' right to speak to do that.
And so you believe the staff would be capable of
Yes,
we have mayor requests, go
Yes.
back and figure this out, and
Yeah, I mean, the upside, with a sort of average size property of what we've gotten for zone changes, because it only takes one, there's usually a couple of us shuffling for what, is the address that's closest in here, so we try to go as fast as we can. But we have had to ask for recess before. Totally depends on what property and is the subject property and what properties have protested.
So how does that, so I guess maybe I didn't understand, but the process, I haven't been to the city council where that happens, but so is it that the city council has the citizens forum where people are coming up to speak and then they say, oh, by the way, here's a piece of paper, I'm filing a legal protest?
Again, in the half dozen or so that I've done, there's a 2-week notice period before any public hearing, and some will come in anytime in that 2-week period, and we'll present the graphic analysis as a part of our presentation. Sometimes it's just handing it to the clerk, sometime during the day, and she'll timestamp it. I've seen folks hand it to her to timestamp right before a hearing. I've received one personally just sitting at the staff table before that particular agenda item has happened. So,
that's
the
the latest.
purpose of this is to allow a protest. So we have been generous in the silence of the charter of saying we will take it in sort of any way, shape, form. There's no standard form or template. It doesn't need to be notarized. What's clear to the city's attorney is the charter intent was to allow property owners the protest right. So we don't create any limitation on that. And we aren't through this either. We can't, right? It just clarifies what we do once we get it, essentially.
So could you theoretically be 50 people giving testimony, someone writes down a piece of paper, I file a legal protest, hands it to you, and now you have to stop, take a recess, validate it?
That has not happened, but that would be allowed to happen.
Okay.
The city attorney has opined that you can receive the protest up and until the hearing is closed, which is, happens after all the testimony is received.
And then if you find during that recess that it is a valid protest, this person does own within that radius, then that automatically delays the hearing until the...
Right, so it does two things under this proposed code amendment. We come back in, we say we've confirmed ownership, we've confirmed it passes the 20% area. The hearing would be not closed, but continued, meaning then we can take additional testimony at that new date, knowing that this is now the stakes have been raised. Again, a couple things. So there are people signed up to speak. It probably makes some sense to hear from them, and then you can make a motion, have more discussion, unless there's more questions. It doesn't affect your proceedings at all. So I'm not saying you should be doing the will of council, but it's ultimately sort of, they put themselves in that situation if they choose to adopt this code amendment. It has to be in chapter 26 under your jurisdiction because it relates to zone changes. So I think they welcome, as always, your thoughtful comments, or do we disagree on the graphics, or those types of things, but it won't affect the hearing as it occurs in this chambers on Thursdays at Planning Commission. It will affect the council proceedings.
Okay. Are there any more questions for staff? Let's open up the citizens forum. There will be a 3-minute time limit. Time may not be yielded to another person. And see, we have 3 people signed up to speak. And even if you're not on this sheet, you can still come forward. The first one I have is Megan Schleicher. If you could give your name and address. I know you signed up, but...
Hello, my name is Megan Schleicher. I live at...
Can you spell your last name, please?
SCHLEICHER. Hopefully that doesn't count against my 3 minutes. I live at 10315 West 33rd Avenue in District 3. You ready? Okay. So I apologize. It's always when something spurs our participation as citizens that we all of a sudden try and become armchair experts. And I just want to, first of all, express my gratitude to all of the commission members and the city division, planning division staffers for your tireless public service.
I also work as a full-time public servant, so I know it's often a thankless job. In reading the website for the Planning Commission, I saw part of the mission statement is, and I guess it was actually the Planning Division, the mission statement is to make sure there's direct assistance to the citizens. And my first comment with this Planning Commission legislative item staff report is the summary, background, and proposed code amendment wording in the first part of this document had my head spinning. And I don't feel that that's direct service to the citizens who work full-time. I have 2 children under 5 at home. This is a big sacrifice to come. I know you all are doing this as your jobs, but I feel that a lot of the comments I've been hearing have been focused on the inconveniences for the developers, but I will say the time put in by the citizens is also stressful and challenging. So that was my first comment. Second comment is that the proposed ordinance actually made a lot more sense than the additional supplemental documentation. My first point of concern in this proposed ordinance is Section 7B. If necessary, the mayor shall declare a recess or ask that the hearing be continued to enable the community development staff to perform their review. I would propose that, first of all, multiple continuances or one continuance actually takes time away from the citizens. So being at this meeting tonight, being at my first city council meeting on Monday, it's all been a great deal of time away from my family and time even trying to fit this into my work schedule. So it's not just about, I'm sorry, there's lights flashing at me. Okay. It's been 3 minutes? Okay. So this takes away from us. And then primarily my concern is Section 7C. If the community development staff determines the protest does not meet the owner or area requirements of Charter 510, no further action shall be taken. The hearing may be conducted and closed, and the council may act without the 3/4 majority voting requirement. So that took away all of the citizens' rights right there. And I will say that if the meeting or these maps are being checked upon anyway, if we could just be provided as the citizens the maps with the addresses in advance to make sure that we don't make a mistake that would then lead to less votes being required, everybody would be supported. Thank you.
Thank you. The next person is Sirma Quinones.
Good evening. My name is Sirma Quinones, and that is S as in Sam, Y-R-M-A. The last name is Q-U-I-N-O-N-E-S. And I live at 10270 West 33rd Avenue. I am here to echo precisely what Megan was just speaking about. It's the concern comes from the time dedicated from a citizen's perspective and the time that it does take for us to prepare to review documentation that we're not accustomed to reading and having to define all of the language and getting comfortable with that. As much as it was expressed that it would be a detriment to the developer, I find it interesting because if we're considering a rezoning of an area and those of us that live right on within 100 feet from that property are directly affected, there's something that needs to, I think we need to shift the focus from the detriment to the developer to what is going to happen with a concerned citizen and what's going to happen with their property. So definitely on the aspect of the delays, it is my biggest concern because our participation is required in order for us to have a voice within the city of Wheat Ridge. And continuing to extend it, it could be a detriment to defining exactly what it is that we need and making sure that all the voices are being heard in the time that is allotted for. So if we could not have that extension, I think that would be ideal. That is all.
Thank you. The next one is thank you.
Good evening. My name is Ihor Figlus, Figlus. I live at 9775 West 36th Avenue. This is really troubling, this whole ordinance. Although legal protest may only have been used a handful of times in the past 9 years, it's been used 3 times in the past year. Once at 9800 West 38th Avenue, once at over here at 40th and Upham, and the other time was on Tabor Street. At best, changes in this ordinance are unnecessary. At worst, they are erroneous and represent an attempt to subvert the Wheat Ridge City Charter and expose the citizens of Wheat Ridge to potential abuse. First, Section 1, Part B. There is no reason to allow the continuance of a hearing. Online, Jefferson County records can quickly and easily identify the distances among properties. Mayor should not be allowed to continue the hearing. Because a legal protest is made under oath, if someone falsely identifies themselves as an owner of a property which allows them to file a legal protest, they would be subject to penalties of perjury or worse, and their false protest would likely require the reopening of the hearing and revoting of the application. It would be more appropriate, as was mentioned, for city staff to prepare a list of possible legal protests in advance of the hearing. Next, Section 1, Part D. Part C. This is a spurious item. It is clear that if the requirement for legal protest is not met, there is no legal protest. Section 1, Part D. The language of the Wheat Ridge City Charter regarding legal protest of a zoning change is quite specific. It states that a legal protest may be submitted as late as the actual hearing on the proposed zoning change. It specifically does not say 1 week before or 1 day before. There is specifically no requirement to submit a protest in advance. I think there is a clear reason for the way the charter is written. The reason is to prevent possible undue influence on a protester. Protesting the vote on zoning for 2 weeks opens up the potential for an unscrupulous applicant to attempt to intimidate someone who has protested the zoning change into withdrawing the protest. And I can tell you from my personal experience in the past 3 rezonings, there has been one time that one of the persons who filed legal protest has expressed their trepidation about it and their concern about being subject to such undue influence. Requiring the city council to delay the vote is akin to implementing a 2-week advance requirement for filing a protest, but the charter clearly wants citizens to have the options for a last-minute protest. The delay in the vote inconveniences both the applicant and the citizens who have made the effort to attend the public meeting. Requiring 2 weeks changes nothing about the zoning application. The only thing that can legally occur during the ensuing delay is the withdrawal of the legal protest. So what is the possible purpose of this clause? It's not hard to see that this delay creates great opportunity for undue influence on the protester or an attempt to violate quasi-judicial rules.
I'm sorry, but your 3 minutes is up.
Well, this is important. May I speak? May I have another minute to speak?
Sir, we have 3 minutes left,
I know,
everybody.
but this is important. This is an important issue for the citizens of Wheat Ridge, so I request that
Please just wrap it up quickly if you would,
Okay.
Mr. Figlus. Thank you.
Section 1, Part E, I think Commissioner Peterson was correct. If you interpret it strictly the way city staff says, that it's directly opposite and do not include the corners across the street, they tell you to stop there. But he's correct. In reading further on in the ordinance, it does talk about diagonal, and this is a perfect example of city staff attempting to narrowly interpret code in a way that limits rights of citizens of Wheat Ridge. And the clause exempting in Section 4, Part 3, Subpart 3, the clause exempting city-owned property from the calculation should remain in the code. Otherwise, this allows the city to possibly subvert the rights of its citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other citizens that would like to come forward? In the audience? Please state your name and address again.
It's Elizabeth Grant, 3881 Estes Street. On an overview, I'd like to say that with a 6-acre lot that came up, a notice to the neighbors, 100 feet doesn't seem to be enough for a 6-acre lot. If you have a 6-acre lot on 2 main thoroughfares, it should involve at least a 3-mile area within Wheat Ridge, of course not going into Lakewood because Lakewood is nearby. But 100 feet is ridiculous, and it's it's like missing the point. Our town is so small. We have a beautiful town. I came from a town that got wrecked by developers, so that's my background. I've lived here most of my life, but I was there as a teenager, and then I came here. So I just want to warn you, this is a very, very, we're getting closed in, and I was told that because developers have been given restrictions in the neighboring suburbs, they're all coming here. And they're coming here because they need to have work and they want to have something to do. And I think you've got to give the citizens as much clout as you give the developers. And you, sir, you kept saying the developers this and the developers that, as though we are inconveniencing them. Our town's been around, 1890, our pond at the corner was established, and I live in what used to be a big orchard. And we have just so much more land that's available. This 6 acres is very inappropriate for a 60-unit development, which he would then push to another 120 possibly under the zoning laws. Please, I don't think the wording here is good. I think you should change it to a 3-mile area. I think more citizens ought to be listened to. I don't like the fact that people come up and plead and beg, and then council ignores them and acts like, they don't count. It's not right. It's not right. This town has a finite amount of area that can be developed. This is a prime area. That area there, that 6 acres is, where is another one like it? And you've got to take some thought, and the developers can take some time too. This isn't a quick fix thing. We've got to work together. And I have a dry mouth. But maybe my time's up, I don't know. But please think about the fact that citizens really want to be involved and they want to have a say-so. And like Megan said, we take out our time too, and we have tons of other things we have to do, but we come because, man alive, my neighbor was friends with Jack Prouse when Jack Prouse was the head of the building department, and they took advantage of me and they didn't let me know and put up a barn. They put up a garage the size of a house 4 feet from my lot. And in other words, took away my easement and didn't even ask me. And then a neighbor...
I'm sorry, but your 3 minutes is up.
And a neighbor in back of me, Stephanie McNamara, she built a shed, and I went before that little panel that's supposed to say yay or nay, and I said, take the shed down. It's in the public service easement. They voted just barely for me to win, and I heard tonight that that's illegal. So things are being done and rules are being broken all over the place, and so we can't posture as though we're being so high and mighty. We've all got to work together.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Next, please, state your name and address for the record.
Yes, my name is Annette Bryce, B-R-Y-C-E, and I'm trustee for the home that my mother lives in. She's the trustee maker, or the trust maker, and it's on 10250 West 33rd. And my comment about this whole thing on needing to get 20% of the homeowners that live in this 100-foot halo around the property is that the city should provide us with the names and addresses of the owners that are in that 100-foot radius. And I will make reference to the fact that when you have a 6-acre, very oddly shaped lot it makes it really difficult for a person who's not a surveyor to have any idea where the 100 feet ends. I know that the notices from the developer go out 600 feet. So it's kind of like, well, how do you then get it down to the 100 feet? So I think the city should provide those names and addresses on their website in conjunction with whatever zoning case, I guess you were calling these all cases, so that we can go and get the signatures from the people that it would pertain to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Daniel Bryce. I'm here on behalf of my 97-year-old mother who lives at 10250 West 33rd Avenue. I just want to cover some details on the graphics. I think that whenever you're interpreting a law or an ordinance, that you should err on the side of greater respect for the citizens' rights rather than, narrowing the citizens' rights. So I think the graphics specifically across the street definitely should include the quarter rounds, because if there was no street there, those quarter rounds would be there. I don't see how the addition of the street changes that equation. You have just eliminated the rights of the property owners that exist in those quarter rounds. I also think that if a rezoning occurs on a corner, that those quarter rounds should exist cat-a-corner for the same reasons. And I'd just like to finally say that I think 100 feet is really minimal. I mean, you've already limited the citizens' rights, the property owners' rights by saying only 100 feet. It should be more. Now, I don't know what that number is, but 600 feet, something. And I don't know if we should address that now, but definitely I would like to see the graphics changed and those quarter rounds included, wherever possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, it looks like everybody in the audience has had a chance to speak. I will now close the citizens forum. And let's go through the list of questions. So we had some comments about, two people about that 100 feet is not enough. One comment about extending it to 3 miles. I don't know if you could talk maybe where the 100-foot came up and what the
Sure.
potential cost would be for 3 miles in the process.
Sure. Yeah, I took a couple of notes, so a few things I want to address. So the 100 feet is set by charter. We can clarify the charter. We cannot change the charter through this process. So the only way that anything in the charter can be changed is by a vote of the people. The other dimensions that were mentioned, 300-foot notice for a public hearing, 600-foot notice for neighborhood meetings, those are in the code, so those are eligible to be changed at the direction of, by petitioning council to do a code amendment to change those. The call for having those quarter rounds opposite the street, I think that's been well vetted. You're welcome to include a condition of approval or a recommendation that be modified for council. Again, I think this code is coming from council as their sort of policy direction. So as I mentioned, planning division staff is sort of a neutral party here. The other comment that I heard was relative to providing sort of more information to the public about who's within that 100-foot area. So what we do we often get questions about sort of parcel ownership, whether somebody wants to buy a property or work out an easement or whatever it may be. Jefferson County assessor is where we get all of our parcel information from, all of our ownership information from. The city does not have an online GIS map, but the county does. It's very, very intuitive. We've often walked people through that mapping software in our office, so folks are able to obtain ownership information and sort of do their own measurement analysis. In the spirit of what somebody I think mentioned was undue influence, I would not feel comfortable providing here's the names of the people that you should go knock on their door to sign a protest. because again, we're trying to remain impartial, but we very frequently provide access to those public records and try to make that as easy as possible. And again, in providing these graphics, try to help people understand how we would be calculating it so they could be doing the same in
Would that also
parallel.
be a privacy concern?
Yeah, I mean, ownership's all public records, so we always provide a link to either the assessor's database or their maps as requested. But even when we have an inquiry of like, can I get somebody's information, we just, very hesitant to be that person that's putting that out there, whether it's to the developer or to the neighborhood, again, for that purpose of trying to, we're not trying to facilitate undue influence, I guess I would say. But certainly can lead people to that same information that we're looking at, so they can do it.
So if somebody were within the notification,
Mhm.
which is 600 feet, correct?
For a neighborhood meeting.
For neighborhood meeting, that would put them on the radar that they may or may not be within the 100 feet, and they could contact the
Right.
city
Yes.
and verify that?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the tricky thing there, adding or not adding the wings, again, I'm neutral on this, but when you increase the denominator, you have to increase the numerator to hit a 20% threshold. So this, there are infinite ways this could play out sort of on either side of the coin. We're certainly open to interpretations on the graphic, but the 100 feet can't change because that is set in stone in charter.
And then there was some comments about against multiple continuations.
Yeah.
And it looks like the proposed code is mandating continuances. Could you maybe go over like what is the just so people understand if we're adding or taking away the citizen's right to speak, and the continuation, what the current process is at the city council?
So again, the request to implement this required continuances at the direction of council, not staff. So my understanding of their intent is that it would improve transparency by reducing the surprise factor of introducing a requirement for 6 votes at the moment that that's required. I think, as you've heard tonight, you can argue this sort of a variety of ways depending on your viewpoint on specific cases, but that's my understanding of the intent, is that it is attempting to level the playing field and sort of, make sure folks are of clear mind and having the opportunity to speak. We're very, empathetic, I would say, to the fact that, in my opinion, a public hearing on a weeknight at 7 p.m. lasting sometimes till 1 a.m. is a very archaic system. So I would like to preview the fact that we are in study session in October with both council and planning commission going to be discussing a model that Lakewood has where you have an online public hearing where you have an opportunity to have equal input in an online portal leading up to a hearing that is required to be read by commissioners and council members so that it reduces the burden of having to attend in person in these hours on a weekday. So we'll be exploring that further. So again, very, very aware of that and increasingly aware of that as people are getting really more and more engaged here in Wheat Ridge. So those are independent, but I think it addresses that concern that we're hearing. If there are multiple continuances that we've seen in cases this year, it's hard for a lot of people who want to be involved with that duration of time.
And then it looks like there was support for the last minute protest filing.
What's that?
The support for last minute protest filing.
Yes, and it's my understanding that because of the way the charter is worded, that we can receive a protest up until the moment a hearing is closed. So this code amendment doesn't change how we receive it, it just changes what we do after we receive it. Or what council does, rather.
Were there any other comments or questions that I have not gone over?
Lauren, just clarification. So city council, through a study session, came up with this idea. They went to the attorney and drew up this.
Yep.
And because it's part of Chapter 26, we're looking at it. Regardless of whether we approve it or not, they're going to review and make a decision on it.
Correct. Yeah, good question. So any code amendment requires a hearing before you and city council, and currently the public hearing before city council is scheduled for Monday, September 9th.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify too, based on what some of the people in the audience said, is that you had mentioned if you're concerned about the notification requirements based on how far you are from a property, that's something that needs to be handled through making an amendment to the city charter. Is that correct? So right now, based on what a property owner wants to do with their property, there's only a 100-foot requirement. And so if that is causing concern because people are seeing things change in the community, that then they should approach council to change kind of that distance requirement for notification.
Any other comments? Okay, if there are no further questions or comments for staff, I would entertain a motion. Yes. Yes, I've closed the citizens forum. Mhm. I already did. Call for a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move to recommend approval of the proposed ordinance amending Chapter 26 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning the right of protest procedure for rezoning decisions.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, any discussion? I will not be supporting this for the reasons I stated before. Yes?
Does this vote need a supermajority, or is it just
Good question. No, simple majority
simple majority?
to recommend approval.
I won't be supporting this because I feel that the city council already has the power to continue cases, and the citizens already have the right to speak. What this does is it mandates a continuation instead of giving it. For me, it kind of takes that power away from the city council, and it just simply mandates it and extends the that citizens forum, and then it just becomes more continuances. It seems less efficient, so I will be voting no. Are there any other discussions? Any comments?
Mr. Chairman, I would tend to agree with you on this. There are too many, as it's written, it raises too many questions for me to approve it.
Yeah. I also don't plan to support it for a slightly different reason, and that is that I think the citizens have brought up some really important points, and the city council needs to really address these before it creates yet another ordinance that seems to violate the sensibilities of a lot of people who live here.
Any other?
So this is a question. One more question for Lauren. Assuming it doesn't pass, last time we did a denial, it got a little confusing on what we're supposed to do. So just in case.
Sure. So the last time we had some voting questions, it was related to a quasi-judicial land use application. So in this case, however your vote is and your comments are will stand, and we will just forward that as information of what happened. But no second vote or alternate motion would be required.
We are simply voting whether to recommend this to the council.
Correct, yep.
And even if we deny it, the council takes it up.
Correct, yep.
It's just publicly, I would say I'll also be voting no, just because it sounds like there's lots of confusion that city council should hear. And I just want to go on record saying that there's already a code in place. It needs more due diligence, it would appear.
I would add that a no vote, a disapproval of this recommendation would send a message to city council that this particular, the language in this ordinance, the way it's written, again, raises too many questions, and it's just not something that the Planning Commission feels should go forward.
Any other comments? Call for a vote. This is recommending approval.
Motion failed, 1 to 5.
Thank you. We are now on to old business. Is there any old business?
I don't have any old business.
Is there any
I have new business.
new business? Okay.
So just a couple housekeeping items. Next meeting will be on September 5th. We will have 2 items on that agenda, we think. We will not have the meeting on September 19th. And then we will still plan on having that meeting on October 3rd. I previewed one, we'll do a training, and then we'll also talk about what we're calling inclusive public hearings. As I mentioned, we get a lot of comments from a lot of people who want to be involved and can't show up. So we've been doing some homework on how we can move this process and have people feel like they're being included. Sort of in, it's almost 2020. There's got to be sort of another way to get people involved. So we'll talk about that on the 3rd with you all, and we'll talk about that with City Council on October 7th. For you and for any of the watching public, the City Hall is implementing new safety and security measures starting on Monday. So if you have any business at City Hall or meetings, you'll now be asked to check in at the front desk. Typical would be that we'd scan a driver's license, or we just enter a first and last name, and then you'll get a visitor's badge. It's just a sticky badge that's sort of color-coded so we know which department you're supposed to be in. Our building is from the 70s, so it doesn't meet sort of contemporary security standards. You can sort of walk wherever you want to at this point in time. So we'll have more doors that lock and sort of more, not restricted access, but just maybe controlled access. It's meant to be a security measure for both staff and for visitors, frankly. So we start that on Monday, and we'll be asking for folks' patience. Today is August 19th, and today is the city's 50th birthday. So if you didn't hear that proclamation on Monday, it is officially today. I do have 6 cupcakes over there if any of you want to have blue teeth after this. I think that's all I have for tonight.
I believe there's also a copy of the proclamation that the mayor
Yes,
signed.
it is sitting over there. Yep, good, thank you. And at Carnation Festival, we also received so the plates above here are all from each year of the Carnation Festival. So we have the 50th anniversary Carnation Festival plate sitting down there for folks to view before it goes up on the wall. Yes.
Are there any other questions, comments? Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Is there a second? Any discussion? Call for vote.
Motion passed 6 to 0.